Hello, my name is Sima Shakhsari and I teach at the University of Minnesota. I'm going to speak to you today about the devastating effects of sanctions and war on the Iranian people. I left Iran in 1989, but I lived in Iran during the 8-year war between Iran and Iraq. At that point, Saddam Hussein was backed by the United States and used weaponry provided by the US or dropped chemical bombs from Germany that, with the approval of the United States, on Iranian people. There are still people who are affected by those bombs. Some of them are still alive. And I, like many people who lived through the 8-year war with Iraq, remember what it meant to live under the bombs, what it meant to go to school under missiles, or to lose friends, to lose people in the neighborhood, and to basically live under complete political repression exactly because of the rise of nationalism during the war. Now, what we're dealing with, or the Iranian people in particular are dealing with, are deadly sanctions. And people often assume that sanctions are an alternative to war, but I believe that sanctions are war. In another name, sanctions are a slow way of killing a population, and the Iranian people have been living under sanctions for a long time. And this, of course, precedes Trump's presidency. The first sanctions, in fact, were imposed on the Iranian people in the 1950s with the nationalization of oil. So sanctions often have to do with the geopolitical interests of the US. In post-revolutionary Iran, pretty much the whole 40 years has been under the sanctions. In different times, the sanctions have become tightened. For example, in 2010, during Obama's presidency, Obama basically made the sanctions, as he called it, crippling, and indeed it was crippling on the Iranian economy and Iranian people. My academic work is with Iranian queer and trans refugee applicants in Turkey. And one of the things that I see in my work is that the number of people who left Iran after the tightening of sanctions increased significantly. And this includes not just, for example, trans people who used to get subsidies from the Iranian state for gender-affirming surgeries, but many other people who live in the margins of the Iranian society, including Afghan refugees. There are some like 2.5 million Afghan refugees who live in Iran, who left Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s with the rise of Taliban, but also after the occupation of Afghanistan by the US forces in early 2000s. So many Afghan people have lived in Iran, but after 2010, with the tightening of sanctions, a large number of Afghan people left Iran because they were scapegoated. The Iranian state wasn't generous anymore with refugees, and of course, many Iranian people had to work 2 or more jobs to make the ends meet. And of course, in these times, those who are discriminated against in the job market are refugees, and Iran is no exception to that. So many Afghan refugees left Iran for Turkey, hoping for a better life, which is not quite feasible. But that is, the area of my research, and I don't want to quite talk about that. But I want to say this just to show you how the sanctions have really affected the most vulnerable segments of the Iranian population. One of the devastating effects of sanctions has been with the rise of cancer in Iran. I lost my sister in 2015 to cancer. She basically was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer in 2010, and that was when she started her chemotherapy and radiotherapy. Her radiotherapy was interrupted because all the radiotherapy machines in Iran were shut down by Stuxnet, a virus that was sent by the US to Iran that basically disabled all computers that worked with nuclear technology. That included radiotherapy machines. And my sister was one example of the people whose radiotherapy was disrupted. She was sent to a hospital that had an older machine that wasn't computerized, and the machine didn't have an accurate gauge, and that burned her lungs, and she had to have several surgeries to recover from that. Access for chemo medicine was extremely difficult for my sister, and she had to actually buy her chemo medicine from black market, and she had to go with her children and buy it and carry it in a cooler to the hospital to be administered, because the hospitals don't have access to chemotherapy or chemo medicine. This also, of course, my sister could afford to buy it from the black market, but many people cannot afford to even buy chemo from, the black market. So that is one of the ways that life-saving medicine has been denied to Iranian people, exactly because of the sanctions. Of course, the rate of cancer in Iran has increased drastically, and that has to do in large part with the toxins in the air. And there's a study that has been done that shows that because of the sanctions, Iran, which is an oil-producing company, has not been able to send its crude oil to refineries outside. So it has come up with these homegrown industries for refining oil, and that refined oil that is used in cars, in households, and so on and so forth, has 10 to 800 times more toxins than the international standard, which means that basically there are a lot more carcinogenic elements in this kind of products, which basically is the air that ultimately the Iranian people breathe. And that is why cancer has been on the rise in Iran, in particular since 2010. And even though with the nuclear deal things were relaxed for a while, they have been the sanctions were reinstated with Trump's presidency, and they have become, or they're becoming, worse and worse with time. Now, some people assume that medicine is exempt. On the paper, it seems like there's no sanction. There are no sanctions on medicine, but the fact is that for pharmaceutical companies to sell medicine to Iran, the financial transaction has to go through particular international entities that basically are subjected to sanctions. So they don't, none of these pharmaceutical companies can, in fact, or do, in fact, sell medicine to Iran. A very tangible effect of this is the recent coronavirus pandemic and the lack of access to medicine in Iran. My nieces are doctors in Iranian hospitals, and they tell me that even though there is no treatment for corona, but people, at least in Iran, the doctors are giving 4 medicines to treat the people who are affected by the virus. And of those 4 medicines, 2 of them are non-existent in Iran, and the other 2 that are available, one is rare to find, and they only give those to people who are in critical condition. Of course, there's a shortage of kits and shortage of PPEs and all the masks, gloves, and so on and so forth in many of the hospitals. And even though people assume that the World Health Organization and the international entities sent medicine to Iran, those are not enough for the number of people who are affected by the coronavirus in Iran. Of course, for a population of over 80 million, thinking that up to 80% of the population will be affected by the virus, that is a frightening thought. And imagining that people don't have access to medication or to kits and gloves, so on and so forth, that is really a kind of not so slow death anymore. This is a form of killing the Iranian population under the sanctions. So I think what needs to be done immediately is to lift the sanctions on Iran, and this is beyond what the U.S. claims about Iran's nuclear energy and so on and so forth. The sanctions do not affect the elites or the state. They really affect the most vulnerable segments of the Iranian population. They really affect ordinary people in Iran. And I think for those who live in the U.S., one of the things that you could do is to vote for people who are actually making the lifting of sanctions a priority in their agenda. I think it is time for the American citizens to demand from their representatives that the sanctions on Iran are lifted. Thank you.